My name is Elaine, and at 38, I thought I had most of my life figured out. I had a loving husband, Michael, and a peaceful life until my mother-in-law, Clara, became an unsettling fixture in it. Her interest in our lives, while typical to some degree, was claustrophobic. Nothing prepared me for the cold vacuum that greeted me in our bedroom after the cheer of my mother's 65th birthday party. It was a gut feeling that something wasn't right, a prelude to the bad news I was about to discover. The spot on the dresser where my watch usually lay was empty. It was more than a watch. It was a milestone, a gift worth $12,000 from my mother on my 25th birthday, embodying her sacrifices as a single parent. It was irreplaceable to me. My eyes darted around the room, refusing to believe, but evidence to the contrary was stark and undeniable. "Michael, have you seen my watch?" My voice trembled, laced with a panic that was rising as rapidly as my heart rate. He appeared in the doorway with a composure that felt out of place. "It's okay, Elaine. It's here somewhere. Don't worry about it." He attempted to reassure me, his voice too steady. His calmness was unsettling. How could he be so certain that it was here somewhere? Tension crept into the space between us, as I considered the possibility that he knew something I didn't. "Don't call the police yet," he added quickly, as if he'd read my mind. But the suggestion was unnerving. Our home showed no signs of a break-in, yet my gut told me it was more than a simple oversight. Was he hiding something? Thoughts of Clara and her thinly veiled admiration for the watch returned to me. Was that why he was so opposed to getting the police involved? Ignoring Michael's plea, my hands shook as I dialed 911. The gravity of what I was about to do weighed on me, but there was no other option. The silence from Michael as I explained the situation to the dispatcher was deafening. After hanging up, I faced Michael, seeking answers in his vague expression. "Why didn't you want me to call the police?" I demanded, but he just stood there, silent and evasive. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, the pit in my stomach deepening. I had to know the truth. The watch was more than an accessory. It was the embodiment of my mother's love and the tangible proof of her strenuous journey through my upbringing. It couldn't just vanish, and yet it had. The air tensed as we waited for the police to come. Michael, a statue of reservation, and me, a simmering pot of betrayal and shock. As far as days went, this was rapidly descending into the worst, and it was only just beginning. My fingers drummed on the kitchen counter, every tap a punctuation mark in my silent monologue of disbelief. Michael leaned against the doorframe, his eyes avoiding mine. The silence was oppressive, the weight of the missing watch, an elephant in the room that he seemed all too keen to ignore. "I can't believe you didn't want me to call the police, Michael. That watch wasn't just expensive, it was one of the last connections to my mom's hard work," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "How can you be so indifferent?" "I'm not indifferent, Elaine," he finally spoke, his voice taking on a hint of frustration. "I just think we should look for it more thoroughly before involving the police in this. Maybe it got misplaced or stolen," I interjected. "Michael, we've looked everywhere, and it's not here. It's not like me to forget where I put such a precious thing. You know that." He rubbed the back of his neck, his tell when he was uncomfortable. I knew him well enough to recognize the signs. He was holding something back. Suspicion gnawed at me, my trust waning with each passing minute. "You're not saying something. Do you know where my watch is?" I asked point blank, hoping for an honest revelation. Instead, he shook his head, a feeble attempt at reassurance that failed to comfort me. The uneasy feeling had lodged itself in my chest the moment we stepped into the house. Now it was growing roots. In the hours we'd searched, Michael had remained oddly composed, as though the disappearance of a $12,000 watch was a trifling inconvenience. It didn't add up, especially when Clara popped into my mind. She had never been subtle about her desire for lavish things, her eyes greedy whenever they landed on my watch. The police would arrive soon, and I was faced with a dichotomy, my once unwavering trust in Michael, or the unsettling thought that maybe he and his mother were not as transparent as they had seemed. "You didn't let her come here while we were away, did you?" I asked, dreading the answer. "No, of course not, Elaine," he replied with an uneasy chuckle. "Why would I do that?" I wanted to believe him, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. Michael's mother's shadow loomed large in our lives, her weekly visits blurring the lines between marriage and maternal rule. I recalled the way Clara would command our space as if it were her own, and Michael's lack of resistance infuriated me. The sound of the doorbell sliced through the tension. My head snapped towards it, the chime marking the arrival of the consequences, the descent of the abstract into the painfully tangible. Michael's face paled, and I knew that whatever came next could potentially unravel the life we built together. With a deep breath, I strode towards the door, ready or not for the revelations it would bring. The door creaked open to reveal 2 uniformed officers, their expressions a blend of professionalism and subdued curiosity. "Ma'am, we received a call about a potential theft?" one of them inquired, glancing from me to Michael, now standing awkwardly behind. "Yes, officers. Please come in," I said, mustering a welcome that my rattled nerves barely supported. As they stepped into the house, my resolve strengthened. The law was on our side now. Michael's mother, Clara, had overstepped her bounds one too many times, and if she had taken my watch, justice needed to be served. I led the police into the living room and recounted the events leading to the discovery of the missing watch. They jotted down notes, their eyes occasionally lifting to measure our reactions. "It's an heirloom of sorts," I explained, my throat tightening. "My mother gave it to me on my 25th birthday. It's worth a lot, but not just in money. It's sentimental." "I see," the officer's pen paused. "And you suspected Mrs. Clara, your mother-in-law?" His eyes peered into mine, searching for certainty. I nodded, flashing back to the weekend before. I had caught Clara ogling the watch with an intensity that was discomforting. When she asked to try it on, it almost felt wrong, but I couldn't find a graceful way to say no. "There was this one time." My voice trailed off, lost in the memory of pure disbelief when Clara had audaciously said the watch would look better on her wrist and practically demanded I give it to her. The way Michael had danced around the issue had frustrated me then, but now it filled me with dread. Officer Jenkins followed my gaze to Michael, who was worrying the hem of his shirt with quivering fingers. "Mr. Michael, do you have any idea about the watch's whereabouts?" "No, officer." Michael's voice was a shade too quick, a note too high. "I love Elaine. I'd never let anything happen to her stuff, especially not something that meaningful." But his words, intended to reassure, did nothing to steady the churning in my stomach. Instead, my thoughts spun, piecing together bits of conversations, subtle glances, and Michael's strange reluctance for police involvement. They had to know something. Michael has a key to the house, and so does Clara, doesn't she, Michael? I pressed, watching him with an accusatory stare that made him visibly shrink. His eyes flitted away, guilt etched plainly on his face for the briefest of moments before he managed a weak denial. But I knew the truth even before he uttered it. The watch's absence was a confirmation of my fear that Clara's tendrils had reached into the very sanctum of our private life, deforming the sacredness of our space with her manipulation. And now, with the police here, with questions hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break, Michael and his mother's facade was about to fall away, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The officers exchanged a look that suggested they were no strangers to domestic conundrums woven with deceit. "Ma'am, has anyone else had access to your house recently?" Officer Jenkins asked as he closed his notepad. Only then did Michael speak up, his voice a faint whisper cracking under the intensity of the moment. "My mother has a key," he confessed, his admission hitting me like a sledgehammer to the chest. "What?" I sputtered, my eyes locking onto his in a silent demand for an explanation. "You gave Clara a key, without telling me?" He floundered under my scrutiny, his words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. "I thought it would be helpful. She said she'd help us out around the house while we were away. I didn't think you'd mind." Mind? My entire being recoiled at the betrayal. Never would I have imagined Michael going behind my back like that, especially not to cater to Clara's invasive ways. With every sentence he uttered, I felt the foundation of our marriage crumble. I turned back to the officers, my voice steadying with resolve. "She said she'd been cleaning here over the weekend when we were away. I didn't know. I didn't give her permission." Officer Jenkins took note, while his partner quietly stepped out to make a call. The atmosphere in the room thickened with unspoken truths and suppressed fury. The officers probably saw it all too often, families torn asunder by the very ties meant to bind them, but knowing that didn't make the sting any less acute. "If I could offer some advice," Officer Jenkins began, his tone switching to a gentler timbre, "keep the key issue separate for now. Focus on the missing watch. We'll need to speak with your mother-in-law as part of the investigation." I nodded, feeling the world tilt as my anger with Michael battled against my need to recover the missing piece of my mother's legacy. The other officer returned, gesturing for his partner to join him outside briefly. Alone with Michael, I searched his face for the man I thought I'd married, but all I found was a boy cowering from his mother's shadow. "Michael, I can't believe you did this. How could you?" I asked, my heart aching with a betrayal that felt as tangible as the cold air in the room. He started to respond when the front door clicked open again. The officers re-entered, their faces betraying nothing as they interrupted our private reckoning. "Mrs. Parker, we'll need to visit Mrs. Clara to inquire about the watch. Can you provide the address?" I nodded, feeling a mix of vindication and sorrow. This was it. The turning point where the wishful threads of trust and unity in our marriage would either unravel entirely or be spun into a more complex, resilient fabric. As Michael recited his mother's address, I braced myself for the inevitable storm ahead. The search for my timepiece had served as the turning stone, uncovering a foundation riddled with cracks, and its retrieval would mark the next chapter, of hard truths and perhaps even harder consequences. The sirens in the distance heralded a shift in the air, a palpable signal that the web of concealed truths was about to unravel. Michael's features clouded with remorse, but the time for regret had passed. I watched the officers make their steady way to the cruiser, preparing to confront Clara at her residence. "Elaine, I'm so sorry. I didn't know this would happen," Michael blurted out, his voice thick with desperation. But his words were empty to my ears, hollow promises that could no longer conceal the reality of his deception. "You should have thought of that before, Michael," I said coolly, moments before following the officers to their car. My mind was resolute, a mixture of anxious determination to retrieve the watch and simmering indignation over the betrayal. We arrived at Clara's house, a neatly kept bungalow adorned with Michael's childhood photos lining the mantelpiece and the heavy scent of lavender hanging in the air. The door swung open to reveal a flustered Clara, whose cheeks flushed a deep crimson upon seeing the uniforms. "Clara, have you seen a watch here? A watch that does not belong to you?" Officer Jenkins asked directly, his gaze sweeping the room for any sign of the coveted possession. Clara scoffed, feigning ignorance. "Why would I have Elaine's watch? Michael, tell them. I don't know what they're talking about." But Michael, now pale as paper, could barely meet her eye, let alone formulate a defense. The room seemed to shrink around us, every ornament and picture frame a silent testament to the secret she had hoped to keep buried. After what felt like an eternity, she faltered under the steely stare of the law. "Fine," Clara conceded, retrieving the watch from a drawer in her living room. It looked out of place amongst the clutter, like a stolen gem among false jewels. As she handed it over, unable to mask the flash of resentment in her eyes, a portion of the tension that had been building inside of me dissipated. My fingers wrapped around the watch, the cold metal banishing the hot flashes of anger that had pulsed through my veins. "We'll need to take you in for questioning, Mrs. Clara," the second officer said, her tone firm but not unkind. The ensuing silence was fraught with the unspoken acknowledgement that things would never be the same again. Clara's shoulders drooped, the fight bleeding out of her as she collected a shawl and followed the officers out the door. Michael and I were left in the wake of the storm. The chasm between us widened beyond repair. He reached out for me, but I stepped back, my gaze locking with his in a moment of lucidity. "I trusted you, Michael," I whispered, the watch in my grip grounding me as I prepared to confront both our futures alone. "But that trust is broken now." The silence settled heavily on my shoulders as I stepped out of the house, leaving Michael behind, the watch safely in my possession, but my heart fractured in ways I hadn't anticipated. Soon, I'd have to pick up the pieces, but for now, I let the gravity of betrayal and newfound independence wash over me. As the officers drove away, the engine's hum and the fading sirens underscored the gravity of what had transpired. In the cool blue twilight of that tumultuous day, I sat on the steps outside Clara's house, clutching the recovered watch to my chest, the timepiece a bitter reminder of the intertwined love and lies that had governed my life. Michael emerged from the doorway, his footsteps hesitant as he approached where I sat. "Elaine," he murmured, his voice laden with regret. I didn't look up. "You lied to me, Michael," I stated plainly, cutting through the myriad of emotions with a scalpel-sharp clarity. "You put your mother before your wife, and now, here we are." He sat beside me, exuding a sense of defeat that seemed to fill the space between us. "I know," he conceded. "I was wrong, but I never wanted it to come to this." "Intentions don't always matter, Michael. Actions do. I can't just dismiss what happened because you're sorry." He nodded, his silence a tacit acknowledgement of the gulf that had widened too far to bridge with apologies. In the silent contemplation that followed, I found myself thinking about my mother. She'd raised me to be strong, to value honesty and integrity in relationships. But she also instilled in me the understanding that mistakes, even painful ones, were part of life's journey, opportunities for growth and self-reflection. I rose from the steps, the watch's weight a grounding presence on my palm. "I need time, Michael, to think about where we go from here, where I go from here." He didn't try to stop me as I walked away, each step stirring a potent mix of sorrow for what was being left behind and resolve for the uncertainty ahead. In the days that followed the incident, I contemplated my next steps. The divorce wasn't easy, accompanied by whispered rumors and sympathetic glances, but it was necessary, a step closer toward healing and away from a marriage marred by disillusionment. The once formidable figure of Clara, broken by the repercussions of her actions, had paid the price for the damage done. Her savings were depleted to compensate for the watch's restoration, and the rift between her and Michael grew into an insurmountable chasm. Faced with the harsh realities of her choices, she lived a muted existence, a shadow of her former self. Michael, burdened with regret and tarnished by the domestic turmoil that seeped into the corners of his professional life, left his job amidst the ensuing whispers and speculation. The echoes of our fractured union shadowed him long after our paths diverged. As for me, I returned to the watch box, placing the wristwatch back within the soft velvet confines. It represented a time both treasured and tormented. A period in my life that was over, but would forever realign my perspective on trust, love, and independence. The road ahead was mine to walk alone, and I took my first steps with the certainty that no matter what lay before me, I would rise above the challenges, fortified by the lessons of the past. I was ready to weave a new chapter, appreciate newfound freedoms, and cultivate a future forged from the strength gained in the storm's eye.